The humid air of the forest of death hung heavy and stagnant, clinging to the skin like a second layer of clothing. Deep within the enclosed perimeter, Team 7 moved cautiously through the dense undergrowth, the sounds of their footsteps muffled by the thick moss covering the forest floor. Naruto Uzumaki walked at the rear of the formation, his stomach growling audibly, a sound that seemed dangerously loud in the predator-infested woods. He reached into his pouch and retrieved a bag of potato chips, his movements jerky with agitation. He complained to his teammates about the intensity of his hunger, stating that he hadn't eaten since the night before. He attempted to grip the corners of the sealed bag to open it, his fingers clumsily searching for purchase. The moment he applied the slightest amount of force to tear the plastic open, the bag disintegrated in his hands. It did not rip. It essentially vaporized into confetti, showering him and the surrounding area with a fine mist of potato crumbs and shredded plastic fragments. Sasuke Uchiha turned at the sound of the destruction, his expression shifting from alertness to annoyance. He observed the cloud of chip dust settling over Naruto's orange jumpsuit and asked what was wrong with him. Naruto stared at his empty hands, the ruins of the snack drifting to the ground, and admitted with confusion that he had barely touched the bag. He gestured frantically, trying to explain that he was just trying to have a snack, but his teammates merely shook their heads and continued walking. Naruto sighed, looking at his palms. He recalled the events of the first exam with a sense of lingering dread. He explained internally that he had only passed the written test by sheer luck, as he had been completely unable to mold the necessary chakra for the shadow clone cheat he had planned to use. Instead, a strange, instinctive intuition, a gut feeling that felt alien to his usual thought process, had guided his hand as he blindly guessed the answers to the impossible questions. It was as if a dormant part of his brain had taken over the pencil, filling in the correct bubbles without his conscious understanding. The atmosphere in the forest suddenly shifted. The ambient noise of insects and distant animals died abruptly, replaced by a suffocating pressure that weighed down on the trio's shoulders. Sakura Haruno stopped in her tracks, sensing the killing intent radiating from the trees ahead. Sasuke froze, his hand hovering over his weapon pouch, his eyes scanning the shadows. From the darkness ahead, a figure emerged, moving with a sinuous, unnatural grace. Orochimaru stepped into the dim light, his pale face twisted into a grotesque smile, his eyes fixated on Sasuke. Sasuke found himself paralyzed, not by physical restraint, but by the overwhelming aura of the Sannin. He stood rooted to the spot, his body refusing to obey his brain's desperate commands to flee or fight. Naruto, standing further back, felt a cold spike of fear pierce his chest. He saw the terrified look in Sasuke's eyes and realized that this enemy was on a completely different level than anything they had faced before. Acting on desperation, Naruto brought his hands together to form a hand sign. He intended to use a basic jutsu to create a distraction, something to break Sasuke out of his paralysis. He pressed his index fingers together, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. In his fear, he squeezed his hands together far too hard. There was a sickening crunching sound as the bones in his fingers ground against each other, the joints compressing under the immense, uncontrolled pressure he generated. He yelped in pain and pulled his hands apart, staring at his bruised, throbbing fingers, realizing with horror that he could not perform the simplest of ninja techniques when his emotions were high. Orochimaru, amused by the display, decided to test the blonde boy first. He extended his neck with terrifying speed, his head shooting forward across the clearing like a projectile. He lunged at Naruto, his mouth opening unnaturally wide to reveal elongated, venomous fangs. His intention was to sink his teeth into the boy's neck and instill the cursed seal, harnessing the boy's potential for his own use. The fangs made contact with Naruto's skin, striking the side of his neck. Instead of piercing flesh and injecting venom, a sharp metallic cracking sound echoed through the clearing. Orochimaru recoiled instantly, his neck snapping back to his body with the speed of a rubber band. He brought a hand up to his mouth, touching his teeth in disbelief. Two of his fangs had snapped off at the gum line, shattered by the impact against Naruto's skin. Naruto stood there, blinking, one hand raised to his neck where he expected to feel pain and blood. There was nothing but smooth, unbroken skin, harder than steel. He looked at the fallen teeth shards on the ground, then up at Orochimaru, his fear momentarily replaced by confusion. The Sanin's amusement vanished, replaced by a calculating curiosity mixed with anger. He realized this boy was not the failure he appeared to be. He quickly performed a series of hand signs, slamming his palms into the earth. The ground trembled and split apart as a massive giant snake, one of his most powerful summons, erupted from the soil. The beast towered over the trees, its scales glistening in the filtered sunlight. It opened its maw and descended upon Naruto, intending to crush the boy into the dirt under its massive weight. As the shadow of the beast engulfed him, time seemed to slow down for Naruto. The frantic panic in his mind suddenly quieted. The fear evaporated, replaced by a sensation of infinite density and weight. His facial expression shifted, his eyes losing their wild emotion and becoming deadpan, almost bored. He did not move to dodge. He simply planted his feet firmly on the ground. As the massive head of the snake came down, Naruto raised his right hand above his head. He caught the descending snake's head on his open palm. The impact was cataclysmic. The moment the snake's head connected with Naruto's hand, the ground beneath Naruto could not withstand the force. The forest floor exploded outward in a perfect circular crater, the soil and rock disintegrating from the pressure wave. Dust billowed out in a massive cloud, obscuring the clearing. But in the center of the devastation, Naruto stood firm, his knees slightly bent, his arm holding up the multi-ton summon as if it were a pillow. The snake thrashed and pushed, its muscles straining, but it could not move the boy's hand an inch. Naruto looked up at the beast with a look of mild annoyance, as if he were swatting a particularly persistent fly. He decided to end the encounter. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tapped the snake on the nose. The kinetic energy transferred through his finger was equivalent to a small bomb. The giant snake's head was blown backward, its body convulsing violently before dissolving into a cloud of white smoke. The summon dispelled instantly, the creature returning to its realm, defeated not by a complex technique, but by a single, contemptuous flick. Orochimaru watched from the shadows, his eyes widening in shock. He saw that the chakra signatures were non-existent. This was raw, physical power that defied the laws of nature. He decided he needed to retreat and reevaluate, but he would not leave without marking the Uchiha boy as a contingency. He lunged toward the paralyzed Sasuke. Naruto, seeing the movement, turned, but before he could intervene, Orochimaru had already bitten Sasuke, leaving the cursed seal on the Uchiha's neck. The Sannin then melted into the trees, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared, leaving the three Jonin alone in the ruined clearing. The adrenaline began to fade from Naruto's system, and the sensation of the strange, heavy power receded, leaving him feeling lightheaded. He looked around at the devastation he had caused. The trees for 100 meters had been flattened by the shockwave of his catch. The ground was a crater. He looked at his hands, trembling not from weakness, but from the realization of what he had just done. Orochimaru, watching from a distant vantage point, decided to test one final theory before leaving the area completely. He remained hidden and performed the hand seals for the five-prong seal, a technique designed to disrupt and cut off the chakra flow of a Jinchuriki. He hurled the energy from his position, aiming it straight for Naruto's abdomen. The spectral energy hand struck Naruto in the stomach. The moment it touched him, the seal formula destabilized. Instead of glowing and attaching itself to Naruto's chakra network, the seal construct shattered like glass hitting concrete. It exploded into harmless sparks that fizzled out in seconds. Naruto had no traditional chakra pathways for the seal to disrupt. His internal energy was a chaotic, limitless ocean that such a delicate technique could not hope to contain. Naruto clutched his stomach, feeling the impact but felt no restriction. He looked up toward where he sensed the attack had come from, his frustration boiling over. He was tired, confused, and hungry, and now people were throwing magic at him that didn't even work. He opened his mouth and screamed. He did not scream words of defiance. He simply screamed for the annoyance to stop. The volume of the shout was beyond human comprehension. His vocal cords, reinforced by the same durability as the rest of his body, vibrated with enough force to create a sonic boom. The sound wave rippled outward from him in a visible dome of distortion. The air pressure in the immediate area spiked violently. Every tree remaining in the immediate vicinity was sheared off at the trunk, their canopies blasted away by the sheer force of the air. The clouds above the clearing were parted, blown aside by the column of sound rising into the sky. Birds for miles took flight in terror. The scream lasted only a second, but the silence that followed was deafening. Sasuke and Sakura, who had been thrown to the ground by the initial shockwave, slowly raised their heads. They stared at Naruto, who stood panting in the center of a perfectly circular clearing where the forest had been leveled. Sasuke looked at the boy he had known as a failure, his teammate who could barely do a clone jutsu. The fear in Sasuke's eyes was primal. He saw the crater, the lack of chakra, and the impossible feat of strength. He asked in a trembling voice what Naruto was. Naruto looked at his friends, his own expression mirroring their confusion. He shrugged, implying that he had no idea what just happened. He suggested they keep moving toward the tower, trying to inject some normalcy into a situation that had lost all sanity. As the team regrouped and began to move, leaving the devastation behind them, the narrative shifted inward, delving into the mindscape that resided within Naruto. Inside the sewer-like visualization of his own consciousness, the atmosphere was tense and terrifying. Usually, the massive bars of the cage would contain a furious, arrogant nine-tailed fox, spitting insults and demands for freedom. Today, the massive fox was nowhere to be seen near the bars. The Nine Tails was huddled in the far, darkest corner of the cage, its knees pulled up to its chest, its tails wrapped tightly around itself. The beast, a creature of immense power that had destroyed mountains, was trembling. Its eyes were wide with a fear it had not felt in centuries. It refused to look at the bars, staring instead at the ground as if trying to make itself as small as possible. Standing in the center of the sewer corridor outside the cage was a figure that did not belong in Naruto's mindscape. It was a translucent, glowing spirit of a man. He was completely bald, wore a simple, plain yellow jumpsuit, and wore red gloves and boots. The figure was currently cleaning his ear with his pinky finger, his face completely expressionless, radiating an aura of supreme boredom. He paused in his cleaning and glanced casually toward the cage where the great demon was cowering. The ghostly figure of Saitama withdrew his finger and flicked the earwax away. He looked in the direction of the cowering fox and whispered that the creature was being too loud. The voice was flat, uninterested, and carried a weight of absolute authority that silenced the sewer. The fox whimpered in the corner, acknowledging the presence of the bald spirit that now shared the vessel, a power that made the demon's own chakra feel like a drop of water in an ocean. Naruto walked on in the real world, unaware of the conversation happening in his soul, but driven forward by the residual instinct of a hero who had broken his limiter. The air inside the central tower of the Forest of Death was heavy, thick with the scent of dried blood, sweat, and the metallic tang of anxiety. 24 Jonin stood in a loose formation around the elevated arena, their bodies weary from the grueling trials of the second exam. Anko Mitarashi stood at the forefront, her posture radiating a dangerous, predatory energy as she explained the sudden shift in the examination format. She detailed that too many teams had passed, necessitating a preliminary round to call the numbers before the finals could entertain the feudal lords. While the other ninja listened with varying degrees of focus or apprehension, Naruto Uzumaki stood frozen like a statue in the back of the group. He was not standing at attention out of respect, nor was he paralyzed by the fear of combat. He was locked rigid because he was terrified that if he relaxed his abdominal muscles even a fraction of an inch, the simple act of exhaling would generate enough force to shatter the stone floor and bring the tower down upon everyone's heads. Sasuke Uchiha stood beside him, glancing sideways with a mixture of suspicion and lingering dread. Sasuke remembered the forest. He remembered the crater, the shattered canopy, and the way the earth had split open with a single scream. Seeing Naruto now, standing so stiffly that he looked like a poorly constructed puppet, Sasuke could not shake the feeling that he was standing next to a live bomb with a lit fuse. Sakura, sensing the tension but misunderstanding its source, whispered to Naruto to relax, telling him that he looked like he was about to snap. Naruto did not answer. He merely stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth were in danger of cracking, focusing entirely on the microscopic movements of his lungs. He was engaging every ounce of the Saitama persona's subconscious motor control just to exist in the space without causing a catastrophe. Every breath was a calculated risk. Every heartbeat felt like a drum beating against a dam made of glass. The massive electronic board above them flickered to life, the names spinning rapidly before locking into the first matchup. It was a random lottery, a cruel twist of fate that would pit comrades against one another. The crowd of examinees watched the board intently, calculating their odds. When the names finally settled, the first match was called. Sasuke Uchiha versus some unknown competitor from the Sound Village. Sasuke moved toward the stairs with a dark intensity, the cursed seal on his neck throbbing dully, a souvenir from their encounter in the forest. As he passed Naruto, he hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing as he sensed a strange distortion in the air around his teammate, like heat haze rising from asphalt. But he said nothing and descended to the arena floor. The fight that followed was brutal but brief, ending with Sasuke's victory, though it was clear he was holding back the pain of his curse mark. The matches proceeded in a blur of violence and strategy. Rock Lee defeated Sasuke's opponent in a display of sheer speed that shocked the audience, and then faced Gaara in a terrifying display of defense versus absolute power. Through it all, Naruto stood rooted to the spot, his anxiety mounting with every passing minute. He watched the other Jonin fight with skill, with jutsu, with technique, things he suddenly felt completely alienated from. He could not perform a kawarami without potentially turning the log into sawdust. He could not use henge without the disguise shattering from his fluctuating density. He was not a ninja anymore. He was a physical anomaly wearing a headband. Then the board spun again, and the characters aligned in a way that made Naruto's stomach drop. Kiba Inuzuka versus Naruto Uzumaki. A grin spread across Kiba's face, a confident predatory smirk. He nudged his partner, the small white dog Akamaru who sat perched on his head. Kiba declared that this was the easiest draw he could have hoped for. He gloated openly, stating that the dead last had finally gotten lucky enough to make it this far, but his luck was about to run out. The other Jonin nodded in agreement. The consensus was that Naruto was the weakest link, a loud-mouthed fool who had survived on nothing but dumb luck. Naruto heard the murmurs. He heard the dismissal in their voices. Usually, he would be angry, shouting a retort about how he would be Hokage. But today, the insult washed over him like cold water. He wished he was weak. He wished he was just a normal, lucky loser, because being the weakling meant he could fight without worrying about killing his best friend. The proctor, a scar-faced man named Genma Shiranui, gestured for the two combatants to descend the stairs. Naruto moved his legs with the careful deliberation of a bomb disposal expert. He placed one foot in front of the other, testing the ground before shifting his weight. He felt like a giant walking among ants. Every step felt precarious, the stone groaning under his weight despite his attempts to tread lightly. As he reached the arena floor, the sheer scale of his anxiety spiked. The crowd of Chunin and Jounin watching from the balcony above, the third Hokage observing from his booth, his teammates watching from the rails. All of these people were potential casualties if he lost control for even a microsecond. Genma signaled the start of the match, and Kiba did not waste a second. He immediately popped a soldier pill into his mouth, his energy surging as his senses sharpened to an incredible degree. Akamaru barked, leaping from Kiba's head and undergoing a transformation jutsu to become a perfect clone of Kiba. The two Inuzukas circled Naruto, their movements fluid and feral. Kiba taunted Naruto, telling him to just surrender so he wouldn't get humiliated in front of the crushed Sakura was watching from. Naruto raised his hands, palms open in a pleading gesture, frantically thinking of a way to end this without touching Kiba. If he punched him, Kiba would explode. If he kicked him, Kiba would become a projectile. He needed a distraction. He needed to be a normal ninja for just 10 seconds. Naruto squeezed his eyes shut and focused. He tried to mold his chakra, trying to remember the sensation of the shadow clone jutsu that had been his only reliable technique for years. He tried to form the cross sign with his fingers. Ram, snake, boar, dog, bird, hare, ram, palm, hare. But the Saitama factor rejected the subtlety of the flow. Instead of the smooth circulation of energy required for a clone, the raw physical power residing in his cells surged into his hands the moment he concentrated. He pressed his fingers together to make the seal, and the instability peaked. A clone did pop into existence next to him, but it was not the solid, durable replica of a standard shadow clone. It was a bubble of excess energy, a shimmering, unstable construct of pure force. Before Naruto could even shout a command, the clone destabilized. It popped with the sound of a cannon shot, not a puff of smoke. A blinding flash of white light and a concussive shockwave erupted from the clone's position. The explosion was not directed, but it was powerful enough to lift Naruto off his feet and blow Kiba and Akamaru backward across the arena. Kiba rolled to his feet, rubbing his eyes and coughing from the dust. He sputtered in confusion, asking what kind of weird jutsu that was supposed to be. He assumed it was a failed attempt at a smoke bomb. Naruto landed heavily, stumbling but catching himself. He looked at his hands in horror. He hadn't even meant to attack. He had just tried to make a clone. The proctor narrowed his eyes, looking at the scorch mark on the floor where the clone had detonated, clearly wondering if that was an illegal explosive ninjutsu. Kiba shook off the disorientation and growled. The explosion had angered him. He signaled to Akamaru, and the two of them began to spin on all fours. They initiated their signature technique, the fang over fang. They became spinning drills of chakra-enhanced fangs and claws, tearing up the arena floor as they ricocheted toward Naruto with unpredictable speed. Naruto's instinct screamed at him to dodge. He tried to step to the side, but his body was tense, his movements jerky. He was afraid to move fast because he didn't trust his own momentum. As he hesitated, a speck of dust from the previous explosion drifted into his nose. The tickle was sudden and violent. Naruto felt the sneeze building, a pressure in his sinuses that terrified him. He knew what happened when he sneezed now. He clamped his hands over his mouth and nose, trying to physically suppress the explosion of air. The reaction was immediate. By covering his mouth, he inadvertently created a seal. He inhaled sharply to fight the sneeze, but the Saitama strength turned that inhale into a vacuum. The air pressure in the arena dropped instantly. The spinning Kiba and Akamaru, who were relying on their momentum to carry them into a collision course, found their trajectories violently altered. It was as if a black hole had opened up next to Naruto. The spinning dogs were yanked off course by the sudden, massive intake of air. They lost their rotation, their control slipping as the atmosphere rushed toward Naruto's lungs. Naruto could not hold it anymore. He let go of his nose and sneezed. It was not a human sound. It was a sonic boom directed outward from his face. The blast of air hit the arena floor with the force of a freight train. Dust, debris, and loose stones were pulverized instantly. The shockwave caught Kiba and Akamaru, who were still trying to recover from the vacuum pull. They were blasted backward, tumbling end over end through the air, crashing into the stone wall of the tower with a sickening crunch. The wall didn't just chip. A spiderweb of cracks appeared instantly, and a section of it gave way, burying the two Inuzukas in rubble. The stadium fell into a dead, absolute silence. The proctor stood frozen, his senbon needle dropping from his mouth. The watching Janine stared with mouths agape. Naruto stood alone in the center of a newly formed trench in the floor, the air around him shimmering with heat from the friction of the sneeze. He wiped his nose with the back of his hand, looking at the devastation with wide, terrified eyes. He hadn't even used a jutsu. He just sneezed. Slowly, the rubble at the base of the wall shifted. A groan emanated from the pile of stones. Kiba pushed a large slab off his chest, his body battered, his clothes torn, his consciousness barely holding on. Akamaru whined weakly from underneath a pile of rocks nearby. Kiba struggled to his feet, swaying violently. He was a ninja, and his pride wouldn't let him stay down to a sneeze. He gritted his teeth, blood running down his forehead, and charged one last time. He wasn't thinking clearly. He was running on adrenaline and rage. He roared, leaping toward Naruto, his fist raised, intending to land a single hit before he collapsed. Naruto saw Kiba coming. Panic spiked in his chest. He didn't want to hurt Kiba anymore. He just wanted him to stop. Naruto squeezed his eyes shut, terrified of the impact, and threw a single, desperate defensive punch into the empty air in front of him. He didn't aim at Kiba. He aimed to the side, hoping to miss entirely. He put no intent to kill into the strike, only the desire to push the attacker away. His fist moved. It was not a blur. It was a deletion of space between point A and point B. The air displaced by the movement of his hand didn't just move. It solidified into a wall of pressure. Naruto missed Kiba's body by 3 feet. He missed completely, but the shockwave from the punch did not miss. The air pressure slammed into Kiba mid-leap. It stopped his forward momentum instantly and flattened him against the stone wall behind him. It wasn't a violent collision. It was a sudden, overwhelming compression. Kiba was pinned to the wall like a butterfly in a display case. The wind knocked out of him so thoroughly he couldn't even gasp. The stone wall behind him groaned, the mortar turning to dust under the pressure transferred through Kiba's body. The proctor stared, his eyes widening as he watched Kiba suspended against the wall by nothing but air. Naruto opened his eyes, trembling. He looked at his fist, then looked at Kiba plastered against the wall. He looked at the floor, which was cracked where the air from the punch had driven downward. He spoke, his voice trembling so violently it was barely a whisper. He stated that he had missed. He asked frantically why the wall had broken if he had missed Kiba completely. The proctor shook himself out of his stupor. He looked at Kiba, who had slid down the wall and landed face first on the floor, unconscious and twitching. Akamaru was already out cold. The proctor raised his hand and declared Naruto the winner. There was no cheering. There was no applause. The arena was silent, the kind of silence that usually follows a natural disaster. The other Janine looked at Naruto, not with respect for his victory, but with the primal fear one reserves for forces of nature that cannot be reasoned with. High above the arena in the VIP box reserved for the village leadership, the third Hokage stood with his hands gripping the railing so tightly his knuckles were white. His pipe had gone cold in his mouth. He had seen many things in his long life. Jinchuriki losing control, ancient bloodlines manifesting, the tailed beasts rampaging. But this was different. There was no chakra spike, no demonic energy. Just a boy who sneezed and destroyed a wall and punched the air to knock out a Jonin-level opponent. The Hokage's calculating mind raced. He saw a threat to the village infrastructure that was potentially greater than the Nine Tails itself, because at least you could seal a demon. How did you seal a sneeze? As the medical team carried Kiba and Akamaru away on stretchers, the camera panned across the stands, lingering on the shadows in the upper tiers where the spectators sat. Blending in perfectly with a group of random shinobi was the disguised form of Orochimaru. The Sannin had come to witness Sasuke's progress, to gauge the potential of the Sharingan. But now, his attention was entirely fixated on the orange-clad boy standing confusedly in the center of the arena. There was no fear in Orochimaru's yellow, slit-pupiled eyes. There was no revulsion. There was only a manic, terrifying curiosity. Orochimaru held a small notepad in one hand, a pen scratching furiously against the paper. He was ignoring the match happening below between Zaku Abumi and Shino Aburame entirely. He was sketching the trajectory of the air displacement, calculating the force required to crush stone without physical contact. He whispered to himself, his tongue flicking out to taste the air, as if he could sense the residual energy of the Saitama soul lingering in the arena. He muttered about infinite density and the absence of any chakra signature. He wrote that it was perfect, a specimen without limits, a container that did not hold a demon but held something else entirely. Orochimaru smiled, a wide, predatory grin that promised months of painful experimentation. He had found a new vessel, one that made the Uchiha clan look like children playing with toys. He closed the notepad, his eyes gleaming with a dark obsession, already planning how to capture this boy who broke the laws of physics. Naruto walked back up the stairs to the observation deck, his head hung low. He felt the crowd part around him, the other Jonin stepping back to give him a wide berth. Even Rock Lee, the master of taijutsu, looked at Naruto with a mixture of awe and confusion, unable to comprehend the kind of training could produce such an anomaly. Naruto reached the railing and stood next to Sasuke and Sakura. Sakura looked at him, her expression conflicted, unsure whether to congratulate him or run away. Sasuke didn't look at him. Sasuke just stared at the floor, his fists clenched at his sides, realizing that the gap between them was not a gap of skill, but a gap of existence. He was a ninja. Naruto was a god wearing a ninja's headband. The crushing weight of that reality settled over the team, heavier than the tension of the exams, heavier than the looming threat of war. Naruto stood there, silent and miserable, wondering if he would ever be able to touch another human being without breaking them. The steam rising from the outdoor baths swirled thickly in the cool evening air, obscuring the wooden fences that divided the private soaking pools from the dense forest beyond. Perched precariously atop a high branch in a nearby tree, the legendary Sannin known as Jiraiya adjusted his position with the practiced silence of a master spy. His notebook was open, pen hovering over the page, but his attention was momentarily diverted from his usual research by a thermal anomaly occurring just a few yards away. He peered through the gaps in the foliage, his eyes narrowing as he observed the large communal bath. While other shinobi washed and relaxed in comfortably warm water, the surface of the water in the corner where the blonde Jinchuriki sat was violently agitated. It was not merely hot, it was boiling. Bubbles the size of fists roiled to the surface, popping with audible hisses, yet Naruto Uzumaki sat slumped against the rocks, submerged to his neck, looking completely relaxed and even rubbing his arms as if the temperature were merely lukewarm. Jiraiya watched in disbelief as the boy dunked a washcloth into the water, pulled it out steaming, and wrung it out without flinching at the heat. The toad sage realized with a jolt of alarm that the water was not being heated by a furnace or a jutsu. The boy's passive body heat was raising the temperature of the entire spring to a dangerous degree simply by existing within it. Jiraiya closed his notebook with a snap, his expression shifting from lecherous intrigue to deadly seriousness. This was no longer just about the Kyuubi. The boy was a walking nuclear reactor, and he didn't even seem to know it. The training ground selected for the month-long intensive preparation was a remote, rocky clearing located miles from the village proper, a necessary precaution given the Hokage's report about the boy's lack of control. Jiraiya stood before his new pupil, arms crossed over his red Hayori, studying the boy who stood looking dejectedly at a scroll laid out on the flat boulder before them. The Sannin had been briefed on the incident in the preliminaries, the sneeze that had demolished a stone wall, but reading about it and witnessing the raw potential were two different things. Jiraiya needed to understand the mechanics of this power. If the boy could not use traditional chakra molding, then perhaps the summoning contract would allow him to channel his energy externally. The legendary ninja explained the concept of the summoning jutsu, detailing how it required the user to mold their chakra with a specific ratio of spiritual and physical energy, mix it with the blood from a contract, and then push that energy into a different dimension to retrieve a familiar. He watched Naruto's face carefully as he spoke. The boy nodded along, but his eyes held a glazed confusion, the look of someone trying to understand a foreign language without a dictionary. To demonstrate the necessity of fine motor control, Jiraiya handed Naruto a simple, small orange from his pack. He instructed the boy to peel it without tearing the rind, a task requiring precise pressure and delicate touch. If Naruto truly possessed the raw power of a Biju without the control, he should fail miserably, crushing the fruit into pulp in his grip. Naruto took the orange, his brow furrowing in concentration. He raised the fruit to eye level, his thumb digging into the peel. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a motion so fluid it seemed practiced, the skin of the orange separated in a perfect, continuous spiral. Naruto pulled the rind away in one long, unbroken strip, revealing the pristine fruit inside, which had not been compressed or bruised in the slightest. He then separated the segments with surgical precision, popping one into his mouth with a satisfied grin. Jiraiya stared at the fruit, then at the boy. It defied logic. The boy could peel an orange with the delicacy of a master surgeon, yet he couldn't perform a basic academy jutsu without causing an explosion. It was the paradox of the Saitama consciousness. Muscle memory handled the mundane tasks perfectly, but the moment conscious intent or ninja logic was applied, the subtlety vanished, replaced by overwhelming force. Determined to bypass the boy's mental block, Jiraiya unrolled the summoning contract, pointing to the space where Naruto was to sign his name in blood. The boy bit his thumb enthusiastically, bringing the digit to the paper. However, before a single drop of blood could well up, the wound knit itself closed. The skin smoothed over, the redness fading in less than a second. Naruto frowned, looking at his thumb, then bit down again, harder. This time, a small bead of red appeared, but by the time he moved his hand to the parchment, the cut had vanished again. It became a farcical struggle. Naruto bit his thumb repeatedly, a frantic rhythm of gnashing teeth, each injury healing almost instantaneously. The durability of his skin was absolute. His body refused to acknowledge the damage as sufficient to bleed. Finally, in frustration, Naruto drove his thumbnail into the fleshy part of his thumb with enough force to break a bone, and managed to smear a streak of blood across the contract before the flesh sealed itself up again. With the contract signed, Jiraiya ordered him to begin the summoning ritual. Naruto took a deep breath, planting his feet firmly on the rocky ground. Jiraiya watched the boy's stance. It was solid, grounded. The boy began to gather energy. In a normal ninja, this would involve the familiar sensation of a coiling spring in the gut, a circuit of electrical flow through the tenketsu points. But Jiraiya sensed none of that. Instead, the air pressure in the clearing began to drop. The wind stopped blowing. The birds in the nearby trees fell silent. Naruto wasn't molding chakra, he was compressing reality. He brought his hands together, interlacing his fingers to form the ram seal. This was the critical moment. The ram seal acted as a focus for the chakra. As Naruto's palms met, the ground beneath his boots groaned. The rock didn't crack, it liquefied, turning instantly to dust under the sheer density of the energy he was unconsciously projecting. Naruto squeezed his eyes shut, visualizing the toad boss, Gamabunta, trying to summon the biggest, strongest creature he could imagine. He pushed that image outward, willing it into existence with a force of will that was entirely too brute for the delicate fabric of space-time. A tear in the sky ripped open above them. It was not the gentle swirl of smoke and mist that usually accompanied a summoning jutsu. It was a jagged rift in the clouds, glowing with a violent, electric purple hue. From this rift, a hand descended. It was not the green, warty hand of a toad. It was a colossal, spectral appendage, composed of what looked like compressed atmospheric pressure and raw spiritual energy. It was massive, easily the size of the Hokage monument, translucent yet glowing with an inner light. The fingers were clawed, the palm etched with lines that looked like burning fissures in the air. It did not emerge with a puff of smoke. It fell with the weight of a collapsing mountain. The impact was catastrophic. The massive spectral hand slammed into the earth just yards away from where Naruto stood. There was no shockwave at first, just a sudden, deafening displacement of air as the space the hand occupied flattened everything beneath it. The training ground, a mile-wide plateau of rock and forest, simply vanished under the palm of the giant construct. Dust and debris were blasted away, shooting horizontally into the surrounding forest like shrapnel from a bomb. The noise arrived a second later, a thunderous boom that rattled the windows of Konoha miles away. Jiraiya was thrown backward, tumbling across the ground as the earth heaved. He scrambled to his feet, staring in horror at the scene. The hand had not dispelled. It remained there, embedded in the earth, its fingers curling slightly, gripping the bedrock of the planet. It was static, a monument to a failed jutsu, radiating a heat so intense that the rocks around it began to glow red. It looked less like a summon, and more like the hand of a dead god reaching out from the afterlife to crush the living. Naruto stood in the center of the devastation, coughing in the dust cloud. He looked at the giant hand, then at his own trembling hands. He hadn't summoned Gamabunta. He hadn't summoned a tadpole. He had called down a catastrophe. The sheer embarrassment of the failure warred with the terror of the destruction. The spectral hand pulsed, as if waiting for a command that Naruto didn't know how to give. Jiraiya realized with sinking dread that the construct was stable. It wasn't going to poof away on its own. It was anchored by Naruto's immense energy, a feedback loop that would sustain it until the boy's chakra reserves ran dry, which, judging by the limitless nature of this new power, might be never. The Sannin moved forward, shielding his face from the heat, intending to dispel the jutsu with a sealing formula, but he paused. The construct was too unstable. Touching it might trigger a detonation. From the dense tree line at the edge of the newly formed crater, a pair of glossy eyes watched the scene with intensity. Rock Lee had been training nearby, running laps around the village when the cataclysm had drawn his attention. He hid in the bushes, his weights lying on the grass beside him. He stared at the spectral hand and then at the small, orange-clad boy standing before it. Lee did not see a mistake. He saw the pinnacle of the strong fist style. To his eyes, Naruto had projected his fighting spirit outward, manifesting his will into the physical realm to crush the earth itself. It was, in Lee's mind, the ultimate taijutsu technique. He watched breathlessly, convinced that this was the secret to surpassing genius, the ability to strike the enemy not with a fist, but with the concept of a fist. He noted the lack of chakra hand seals, the pure physical exertion, and felt his respect for his rival solidify into adoration. He vowed then and there to ask Naruto to teach him how to manifest the spirit giant. In the center of the crater, Naruto tried to recall the jutsu. He waved his hands frantically, shouting for the thing to go away, but his vocal commands only seemed to agitate the spectral energy, causing the fingers of the giant hand to twitch and grind the earth deeper. The construct began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that shook the marrow in Jiraiya's bones. It was overloading. Realizing that there was no jutsu reversal for this, Naruto ran toward the giant hand. He leaped into the air, soaring effortlessly up to the wrist of the spectral construct. He reared his right fist back. If he had summoned it, he could break it. He didn't hold back. He didn't try to be gentle. He struck the back of the giant spectral hand with a punch that carried the intent to shatter the concept of the summon itself. The collision was silent. The shockwave followed an instant later, a wall of force that flattened the remaining trees for miles. The spectral hand did not just shatter, it disintegrated. The energy construct blew apart into harmless motes of light that scattered into the atmosphere like fireflies. The recoil of the punch launched Naruto backward, skipping him across the surface of the lake like a stone, finally burying him in the side of a distant cliff. Jiraiya lowered his arms from his face, staring at the now empty sky. The training ground was gone. In its place was a smooth, glassy crater where the rock had been melted and fused by the pressure. The boy was buried headfirst in a cliffside several miles away, his legs kicking slowly as he tried to extricate himself. The toad sage slumped against a rock, running a hand through his hair. He had intended to teach the boy to control the demon fox's chakra. Instead, he had stood witness to the fact that the demon fox was irrelevant. Naruto Uzumaki was a weapon of mass destruction that needed nothing more than a thought to level a mountain range. Teaching him ninjutsu was not just impossible, it was suicidal. Jiraiya walked over to the cliff and pulled Naruto out of the rock. The boy spat out a mouthful of stone, looking battered but physically unharmed. He looked at his teacher with wide, apologetic eyes, expecting a scolding. Jiraiya looked at the devastation, then at the boy, and let out a long, weary sigh. He realized that the Cape Baldy presence he had sensed, a term coined by the Toad Sage's own spy network regarding a mysterious figure, was not just a rumor. This power was absolute. It ignored the laws of nature that govern the ninja world. There would be no teaching of chakra control today. There would be no summoning toads. The only thing they could do was wait for the tournament and hope that Naruto could survive the weight of his own strength without killing someone. Jiraiya patted the dust off Naruto's shoulder, wincing as even that casual touch made the air ripple. He told the boy to take a break, deciding that the best training for now was to do absolutely nothing. As the days passed and the date of the final matches approached, the village buzzed with reconstruction efforts and speculation. The destruction in the training grounds had been blamed on a rogue earth jutsu during a practice session, a cover story invented by the Anbu to prevent panic. Naruto found himself wandering the village, keeping his hands in his pockets to avoid accidentally touching anything. The isolation he felt was profound. He saw other Jonin training with their teams, practicing shuriken throws and sparring, activities that seemed foreign and dangerous to him now. He walked to the stadium early on the day of the finals, needing to escape the crowded streets. He stood before the large bracket board set up near the entrance. He scanned the names, his finger hovering over the chart until he found his own. The path to victory, or disaster, was laid out in ink. His first match was against Neji Hyuga. As he stared at the name, a shadow fell over him. Naruto turned to see Neji Hyuga standing there, his pale eyes fixed on him with an intensity that was uncomfortable. Neji had been watching him since the preliminaries. The Hyuga prodigy activated his Byakugan, the veins around his temples bulging as he peered into Naruto's chakra network, expecting to see the chaotic chakra of the Nine Tails or the blockages of a dropout. What Neji saw, however, caused him to freeze. His eyes widened slightly, his composure cracking for the first time. He saw no chakra coils. He saw no tenketsu points. He saw no flow of energy. He saw a void. It was as if the boy in front of him was hollow, a human shell containing nothing but absolute emptiness, yet the air around him screamed with a pressure that hurt Neiji's eyes to look at. Neji deactivated his Byakugan, taking a step back, unsettled by the anomaly. He whispered that Naruto was a void, a statement that hung in the air between them. Naruto looked at his feet, unsure how to respond to the truth that he was effectively a ghost in the spiritual world. He clenched his fists, feeling the terrifying weight of his own potential, and walked past Neji toward the arena, walking into the stadium where thousands waited to see the monster they didn't understand. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the hospital room, warring with the distant smell of rain that seeped through the half-open window. Sakura stood near the door, her arms crossed and her expression tight with frustration, lecturing the blonde boy about the fundamental importance of stealth for a shinobi. Naruto stood in the center of the room, his posture rigid, his brow sweating not from illness, but from intense concentration. He was trying to take a single step forward without alerting every sensor ninja in the village. He lifted his foot, moving with agonizing slowness, and lowered it toward the linoleum floor. The moment his heel made contact, a dull, heavy thud echoed through the room, vibrating the bed frames and rattling the glass of water on the nightstand. To his ears, it sounded like a sledgehammer striking pavement. He flinched, pulling his foot back, his shoulders slumping in defeat. No matter how softly he tried to tread, the sheer density of his body displaced air and shattered silence with the force of a falling boulder. Sakura sighed, shaking her head at the impossibility of teaching a boy who couldn't even walk without announcing his presence like a drumbeat. In the bed adjacent to Naruto's, Sasuke Uchiha sat silently, his back against the pillows and his sheets pulled up to his waist. Bandages wrapped around his torso, concealing the mark that had been seared into his skin by the serpent in the forest. His dark eyes were fixed on Naruto, but there was no warmth in them, only a turbulent storm of jealousy and confusion. Since the incident in the Forest of Death, Sasuke had been spiraling. He remembered the primal fear he felt when the giant snake descended, the paralysis of his own body, and the sheer absurdity of Naruto stopping the summon with a single hand. That image burned in his mind, mocking every drop of sweat he had ever shed in training. He viewed himself as an avenger, a genius born of the Uchiha clan, yet next to this dead-last anomaly, he felt fragile, like a dried leaf threatening to crumble at the slightest touch. Sasuke pushed the blankets aside, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. He stood up, ignoring the slight dizziness that lingered from the aftereffects of the cursed seal. He demanded that Naruto follow him to the roof. Naruto looked up, his eyes wide with hesitation. He knew what Sasuke wanted. He could feel the aggression radiating off the Uchiha like heat waves. Naruto shook his head, stuttering an excuse about needing to rest or not wanting to break the hospital tiles. Sasuke's glare hardened, and he hissed that he didn't care about the tiles. He only cared about settling things. He needed to know if what happened in the forest was a fluke, a trick of the light, or if his reality had truly been upended. He activated his Sharingan, the crimson Tamo spinning wildly in his eyes, and grabbed Naruto by the wrist, dragging him toward the door. Sakura shouted for them to stop, but the sheer killing intent emitting from Sasuke silenced her protests. They arrived on the rooftop a moment later, the cool morning air whipping at their hospital gowns. The clouds overhead were gray and heavy, mirroring the tension between the two members of Team 7. Sasuke paced away, putting distance between them, then turned to face Naruto. He declared that this was a spar, a test to see where they stood. Naruto raised his hands, palms outward, pleading with Sasuke to stop. He explained that he didn't want to fight because he was terrified of what would happen if he let loose. He told Sasuke about the struggle, about how even a simple tap could shatter bone, how he felt like he was holding a collapsing star inside his body. Sasuke sneered, interpreting the refusal as arrogance. He believed Naruto was mocking him, hiding behind excuses to avoid showing his true power. The Uchiha's demeanor shifted from cold anger to explosive fury. He brought his hands together, forming the familiar seal, and concentrated his chakra. The air around him began to crackle with blue electricity, sparks flying wildly as the sound of 1,000 birds chirping filled the rooftop. The Chidori. It was an assassination technique, a blade of lightning capable of piercing through steel. Sasuke lunged forward, his feet tearing up the roof membrane as he propelled himself forward. He screamed Naruto's name, driving the ball of lightning directly toward his teammate's chest. He expected Naruto to dodge, to block with a jutsu, or to counter with a shadow clone. He expected a ninja's reaction. Naruto stood perfectly still. He didn't dodge because he knew that if he moved too quickly, the wind pressure alone could blow Sasuke off the building. He didn't raise his hands to defend because he knew his blocks were too hard. He simply took the hit. The Chidori struck him squarely in the center of his chest, dead over the heart. For a microsecond, the lightning flared brilliantly, illuminating the rooftop in a blinding azure flash. Then, the chirping sound died abruptly. The lightning dissipated instantly, scattering like sparks hitting a wet pavement. Naruto's flak jacket was scorched black, the fabric smoking with a small hole revealing the mesh shirt underneath. But the skin beneath was unbroken. There wasn't even a bruise. It was as if the attack, an rank technique capable of killing a Jonin, had struck a diamond wall. Sasuke stumbled back, his hand smoking from the recoil of his own jutsu failing. He stared at his hand, then at Naruto, his eyes wide with disbelief. The Sharingan deactivated, the chakra drain too sudden to maintain. He gasped, his breath hitching in his throat as he looked at the singed mark on Naruto's chest. He had felt the resistance. It hadn't felt like flesh or bone. It had felt like hitting the earth itself, an immovable object that simply refused to yield. Naruto looked down at the hole in his jacket and sighed, the sound heavy with exhaustion rather than pain. He brushed a stray piece of ash away, looking at Sasuke with eyes full of sadness. He took a step forward, closing the gap between them. Naruto reached out slowly, intending to place a hand on Sasuke's shoulder to offer comfort, to show that they were still friends despite the power gap. He moved with the grace of Saitama's past life, his muscles micro-adjusting to ensure the touch would be as light as a feather. He tapped Sasuke gently on the shoulder. It was a motion calculated to be reassuring. But to Sasuke, who had just felt the density of that body stop a lethal attack, the touch felt like a coiled snake ready to strike. Sasuke flinched violently, recoiling as if burned, stumbling backward until his heels hit the ledge of the roof. He looked at Naruto with genuine fear, not the fear of a strong opponent, but the fear one feels when looking at a monster that wears human skin. The emotional distance between them widened into a chasm. Sasuke realized then that he could never follow his path of revenge if this was the benchmark. He didn't need to save Naruto from weakness. He needed to save himself from being irrelevant. Before the situation could escalate further, the door to the roof burst open. Jiraiya the Toad Sage stepped out, his usually jovial face grim and serious. He had been watching from the shadows, observing the interaction with the analytical mind of a spy master. He moved between the two boys, placing a hand on Sasuke's chest to push him back. Jiraiya looked at the Uchiha, his voice dropping an octave as he delivered a harsh truth. He told Sasuke that he was chasing a shadow that had no substance. He explained that Naruto was no longer a ninja in the traditional sense, that attempting to measure himself against Naruto was like trying to measure the depth of the ocean with a ruler. He stated plainly that Naruto was a natural disaster given form, and that challenging him was an act of suicide, not competition. Sasuke lowered his head, his fists clenching at his sides until his knuckles turned white. The crushing weight of inferiority settled over him, heavier than any training gravity seal. Without a word, Sasuke turned and walked back toward the stairwell, his shoulders slumped in defeat, leaving Naruto and Jiraiya alone on the windswept roof. Jiraiya turned to Naruto, placing a heavy hand on the boy's head. He didn't scold him, he simply checked him over, ensuring the Chidori hadn't actually caused internal damage despite the lack of external injury. He sighed, realizing the enormity of the task ahead. Teaching this boy was not about building him up, it was about keeping him from tearing everything down. The Sannin led Naruto back inside, deciding that the best course of action was to keep him occupied with something harmless until the exams began. As they walked through the hallway, a green blur intercepted them. Rock Lee stood before them, his teeth sparkling in the fluorescent light of the hospital corridor. He had seen the smoke from the roof and felt the surge of energy. Lee did not look at Naruto with jealousy like Sasuke, nor with fear like Neji. He looked at him with stars in his eyes. He bowed deeply, declaring that he had witnessed the truth of Naruto's taijutsu. He spoke with passionate fervor about the power of youth and the body. He challenged Naruto to a contest of speed to the village gate and back, claiming that he wished to test his own springtime of youth against Naruto's raw power. He assured Naruto that he wouldn't use any jutsu, just pure running speed. Naruto hesitated, looking at Jiraiya. The Toad Sage shrugged, figuring a race was harmless enough compared to a fight to the death, provided Naruto remembered to keep his feet on the ground. Naruto accepted the challenge, desperate for a chance to interact with someone who didn't look at him like a bomb waiting to go off. He wanted to prove that he could be fast without breaking the world. They stepped out into the street, the wet pavement glistening under the overcast sky. A small crowd of nurses and patients had gathered at the hospital entrance, curious about the commotion. Sakura stood among them, looking worried. Lee dropped into a sprinter's crouch, his muscles taut and ready. He told Naruto that the goal was the village gate and back, a round trip of several miles. Naruto nodded, getting into a runner's stance. He focused intensely, telling himself to be slow. He visualized himself moving at a normal Janine pace. He thought about not breaking the sound barrier. The problem was that his definition of slow and the universe's definition of slow had diverged significantly. Lee shouted go, and they launched themselves forward. Lee was fast, his feet a drumbeat against the stone as he activated his weights, his green legwarmers flapping in the wind. He shot forward like a cannonball, turning the corner toward the main street. Naruto pushed off with his right foot. He intended to apply a fraction of his strength, a gentle shove to propel himself forward. The instant his toes left the ground, the pavement behind him cracked, fissures shooting out in a spiderweb pattern. He surged forward, instantly bypassing Lee. The wind roared in his ears, not from speed, but from the displacement of air. Naruto tried to slow down, leaning back and digging his heels in, but his momentum was too great. He passed the village gate in a blur, the guards only seeing a yellow streak and feeling a hurricane-force gust of wind that blew their hats off. At the halfway point, realizing he was going too fast, Naruto tried to decelerate. He planted his foot to turn around. The friction generated by the sudden stop caused the rubber sole of his sandal to vaporize instantly, and the road beneath him ripped up into a trench 10 feet long. He pivoted, his body rotating with impossible angular momentum, and shot back toward the hospital. He saw Lee as a distant green speck, still running his hardest. Naruto panicked. He didn't want to humiliate his friend, but he couldn't stop. As he neared the hospital, the air pressure in front of him compressed into a shockwave. He was moving faster than sound, the barrier of silence broken by his own uncontainable velocity. The sonic boom hit the hospital like a physical sledgehammer. Every window on the facing side of the building shattered simultaneously, sending thousands of shards of glass raining down onto the street below. The shockwave rattled the foundations, setting off car alarms and knocking people off their feet. Naruto screeched to a halt in front of the hospital doors, skidding sideways and tearing a deep gouge into the manicured lawn. He stood there, panting, clutching his chest, looking around at the destruction. The silence that followed the boom was deafening. Lee arrived a minute later, skidding to a stop, his eyes wide with awe. He looked at the shattered windows, the ruined road, and Naruto, who stood unharmed in the center of it all. Lee didn't condemn the destruction, he cheered. He declared it the ultimate leaf whirlwind, a technique of such power that it destroyed the very environment they stood in. He applauded Naruto's dynamic entry. Naruto, however, did not celebrate. He looked at the shattered glass covering the ground, looked at the terrified nurses picking themselves up, and felt a profound sense of shame. He lowered his head, hiding his eyes behind his hiei. He realized that even a friendly race was a disaster in the making. The isolation he felt was absolute. He couldn't play, he couldn't fight, and he couldn't compete. He was a spectator in his own life, forced to watch from behind a wall of invulnerability. Jiraiya walked out through the broken doors, surveying the damage with a weary sigh. He placed a hand on Naruto's shoulder, grounding him, and told him it was time to go. There was nothing more to be gained here. The days following the hospital incident were a blur of nervous preparation. The village was in a frenzy, cleaning the streets and hanging banners for the Chunin exam finals. The destruction at the hospital was officially attributed to a sudden, localized microburst of wind, a lie that nobody really believed, but everyone was too afraid to question. Naruto stayed mostly in his apartment, practicing sitting still without crushing his furniture. He meditated on the concept of softness, trying to visualize his body as yielding like water, but his instincts always snapped back to concrete. The morning of the tournament arrived with a sky so blue it seemed artificial. The stadium was packed to capacity, the stands a sea of colorful citizens and dignitaries from the land of fire and beyond. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, the roar of the crowd a dull rumble that vibrated through the soles of Naruto's feet. He stood in the competitor's tunnel, adjusting his headband nervously. He wore his standard orange jumpsuit, the bright color clashing with the serious atmosphere. To his left, Sasuke stood with his arms crossed, refusing to look at him. To his right, Shikamaru and Shino waited in stoic silence. The other finalists were a mix of intimidating figures: Gaara of the Sand with his gourd and heavy chakra, Temari swinging her massive fan, and Kankuro hunched over his puppet. One by one, the names were called, and the Jonin marched out into the sunlight to the roar of the crowd. Naruto stepped out, squinting against the glare. The announcer's voice boomed over the loudspeakers, introducing the participants. As the announcer reached Naruto's name, the microphone suddenly squealed, a piercing feedback loop that cut through the cheers, forcing the announcer to pull it away from his face. The technical glitch was caused by the sheer pressure radiating from Naruto. The air around him was so dense that it interfered with the electronics. He walked to his designated spot in the center of the arena, feeling the weight of thousands of eyes upon him. They knew what he had done in the preliminaries. They had heard the rumors. They weren't cheering for him. They were waiting to see if he would destroy the stadium. High above the arena, in the VIP box reserved for the feudal lords and the Kazekage, a figure stood out not because of his station, but because of his aura. Orochimaru, disguised in the body of the fourth Kazekage, stood with his hands resting on the railing. His disguise was perfect to the naked eye, but his killing intent leaked out, freezing the air around him. He wasn't looking at the Sharingan, nor was he looking at the Jinchuriki of the One Tail. His gaze was fixed squarely on the blond boy standing in the center of the arena. He had discarded his plans for Sasuke Uchiha, or rather, put them on hold. The boy in the orange suit was a phenomenon that defied every law of jutsu he had ever studied. Orochimaru clutched the railing of the box, his fingers digging into the wood until it splintered. His eyes gleamed with a manic scientific hunger. He didn't fear the boy, he coveted him. He viewed Naruto as the ultimate specimen, the key to immortality. He needed to understand how a human could break the limiter. He needed that power for himself. In the competitor's box, Naruto looked up at the sky, taking a deep breath. He thought about the fight to come. Neji Hyuga was his opponent. He remembered the encounter in the hallway, the accusation of being a void. Naruto clenched his fists, feeling the familiar hum of limitless energy coursing through his limbs. He knew he couldn't win the way a ninja was supposed to. He couldn't use chakra. He couldn't use finesse. All he had was the strength to destroy everything he touched. He closed his eyes, centering himself, pushing the Saitama personality down to the depths of his consciousness. He had to be Naruto Uzumaki, the ninja who wanted to be Hokage, not the monster who could punch the moon. The announcer's voice echoed through the stadium, declaring the start of the first match. The crowd erupted. Naruto opened his eyes, the blue irises sharpening with resolve. He stepped forward to face the Hyuga prodigy, walking toward the center of the arena where destiny awaited. The microphone feedback screeched through the stadium, a high-pitched wail that forced the audience to cover their ears. But the noise was quickly forgotten as the announcer regained his composure and signaled the beginning of the match. The tension in the arena was thick enough to choke on, a stark contrast to the cheering that had greeted previous fighters. Thousands of spectators sat on the edge of their seats, not with anticipation for a close contest, but with the morbid curiosity of people watching a demolition derby. Down in the dirt arena, Naruto Uzumaki stood with his hands loosely tucked into his pockets, his shoulders slumped in a posture that suggested complete apathy. Across from him, Neji Hyuga assumed the traditional gentle fist stance, his legs bent and his palms open, the veins around his pale eyes bulging as the Byakugan activated. The silence stretched on for a long moment. Neji scanned the boy in front of him, his ocular power granting him an X-ray view of the human circulatory and chakra systems. He expected to see the turbulent chakra of the nine tails, the blue coils of energy that every ninja possessed. Instead, his vision met a terrifying blankness. There were no chakra pathways to close, no tenketsu points to strike. It was as if he were looking at a black hole, a physical entity that existed without the spiritual energy that defined life in the ninja world. Neji's eyes widened slightly, the first crack in his stoic facade, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. He declared that Naruto's fate was sealed, that as a failure of the branch family, or in this case a failure of a ninja, he could not defeat a genius. Naruto sighed, a sound that seemed unusually loud in the quiet stadium. He replied that fate was just something people used when they were too lazy to try, but his voice lacked its usual boisterous energy. He looked tired. He looked at Neji not as an opponent to be beaten, but as a porcelain doll he was terrified of breaking. Neji, interpreting this silence as resignation, launched himself forward. He moved with incredible speed, his hands blurring as he struck at Naruto's vital points. Two fingers shot toward Naruto's heart, aiming to stop the flow of chakra, but the moment Neji's fingers made contact with Naruto's chest, they stopped with a dull thud. It was like hitting a solid steel wall covered in skin. The recoil traveled up Neji's arm, jarring his bones. Naruto didn't even flinch. He looked down at Neji's fingers resting on his chest and apologized, explaining that he didn't know how to dodge without making a crater. This only infuriated Neji further. The Hyuga prodigy retreated and began a relentless assault, striking 32 times in the span of 2 seconds. Every blow landed perfectly on the chakra network, yet Naruto did not slow down, nor did his movements become sluggish. The chakra Neji was trying to block simply didn't exist to be manipulated. It was like trying to block the current of a river by punching the water. The energy wasn't flowing in pipes. It was radiating from him in a limitless field. Realizing the gentle fist was useless, Neji leaped backward, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion of hitting an immovable object. The crowd murmured in confusion. They saw Neji landing hits that should have incapacitated any ninja, yet Naruto stood there as if he were being pelted with foam balls. Naruto took a step forward, his foot sinking slightly into the packed earth. He explained that he couldn't use ninja arts, so he would just have to tap Neji on the forehead to end it, a gesture mimicking a familiar brotherly admonishment but intended here as a gentle knockout. This dismissal of Neji's clan's secret techniques was the final straw. Neji roared that he would not be looked down upon by a failure. He dropped into a wide stance, expelled chakra from every tenketsu in his body, and began to spin. The rotation, the absolute defense of the Hyuga, formed a perfect spherical dome of razor-sharp chakra around Neji. It was a technique that could repel any physical attack and slice through steel. Neji launched himself toward Naruto like a human buzz saw, intending to grind the boy into dust. Naruto stood his ground, his expression deadpan. He knew he couldn't dodge without destroying the stadium floor, so he simply waited until the spinning dome was inches from his face. Then he raised his right hand. He didn't punch, he merely extended his knuckles as if to knock on a door. The moment his fist grazed the surface of the spinning chakra dome, the laws of physics that governed the ninja world suffered a catastrophic failure. The rotation did not deflect the hand. Instead, the density and mass behind Naruto's fist overwhelmed the energy construct instantly. The sound was like a windshield shattering on a highway. The dome of chakra fractured into 1,000 particles of light that fizzled out of existence. The shockwave of the collision flattened the grass in the arena and blew the dust away in a perfect circle. Neji was spun out of control, his defense shattered, his momentum arrested by the immovable object that was Naruto Uzumaki. Naruto, realizing his forward momentum was still carrying him forward, and that he was about to crush Neji between him and the arena wall, panicked. He threw his hips back, straining every muscle to stop his movement. He halted his open palm a mere inch away from Neji's forehead. He had stopped. He had checked the swing, but he had forgotten about the air. The displacement caused by stopping a mass of that magnitude so abruptly created a focused concussive blast. It was a cannon shot of pure air pressure, unleashed point-blank at Neji's face. The sound was deafening, a sharp crack that echoed off the stadium walls like a gunshot. Neji's body went rigid and then he was gone. He wasn't just knocked back, he was launched. He flew backward like a rag doll, skipping across the arena floor once, twice, and then smashing through the solid stone wall of the stadium lower tier. The debris from the wall exploded outward, showering the front row spectators in dust and gravel. Neji lay embedded in the rubble of the corridor, motionless. The arena fell into a deathly silence. The proctor stared at the hole in the wall, then back at Naruto, whose hand was still frozen in the air, inches from where Neji had been standing. Naruto slowly lowered his hand, a look of horror dawning on his face. He hadn't even touched him. He had tried to hold back to be gentle, and he had still put a hole through the stadium. The proctor hesitated, looking up at the third Hokage for guidance. The Hokage, his face grave and pale, nodded silently. The proctor raised his hand and declared Neji unable to continue, then disqualified Naruto for excessive force. It was a technicality, a way to end the match without admitting that the winner was a boy who couldn't control the air pressure generated by his own body. Naruto didn't argue. He didn't cheer. He simply turned and began to walk back toward the competitor's box, his head hanging low. He felt the eyes of the crowd on him, and for the first time he didn't imagine them hating him for being a demon. He feared them for seeing him as a freak. Sasuke watched from the railing, his Sharingan active, tracing the lines of destruction. He saw the lack of chakra in the aftermath, the sheer physical impossibility of what had just occurred. Sasuke's grip on the railing tightened until his knuckles turned white, the realization crushing his ego. He realized then that no amount of training, no curse mark, no Sharingan evolution could ever bridge the gap between a ninja and a force of nature. As Naruto reached the base of the competitor box, the sky above the village suddenly darkened. It wasn't a natural cloud formation. The arena lights flickered and died. A heavy, suffocating killing intent descended upon the stadium, freezing the blood of every ninja present. The sound of an explosion ripped through the center of the village, followed by the shriek of giant flutes. The invasion had begun. Panic erupted in the stands as the spectators realized they were trapped. Sound Ninja launched themselves from the stands, attacking the Leaf Ninja and the audience. The stadium dissolved into chaos. Screams filled the air as the giant three-headed snake, summoned by the Sand and Sound Alliance, smashed its way into the arena, its massive coils crushing the stone benches where the feudal lords sat. The Hokage immediately engaged the enemy leader, creating a barrier of light to separate them from the chaos. But the snake was on a rampage, its massive fangs tearing through the architecture, threatening to crush the VIP box and hundreds of civilians. The Jonin in the competitor box were paralyzed by the scale of the destruction, unsure of where to go or what to do. Shikamaru began barking orders, trying to rally them to escape, but the situation was dire. The snake's head loomed over the stadium floor, preparing to strike the panicked crowd. Naruto looked up at the giant serpent. He saw the terror in the eyes of the civilians. He saw the crushing weight of the snake's body descending on the stadium. For a moment he hesitated, the memory of putting his fist through the wall holding him back. But then the persona deep within him stirred. The indifference to the flashy, the boredom with the weak, and the overwhelming drive to protect the innocent clicked into place. His posture straightened. The slouch vanished. His eyes narrowed, focusing on the threat with a clarity that terrified the few enemies close enough to see his face. He realized that he didn't have to worry about winning a match anymore. He didn't have to worry about points or disqualifications. There was no referee here. There was only a monster threatening his home. Naruto bent his knees and lowered his center of gravity. He focused every ounce of his willpower not into his muscles, but into the intention of upward movement. He needed to be up there. He needed to stop that snake. With a sudden explosion of motion, Naruto launched himself into the air. The takeoff was cataclysmic. The ground beneath him didn't just crack, it disintegrated. A sphere of pulverized concrete and dust expanded outward from where he had been standing, blowing Shikamaru and the others off their feet. The shockwave traveled through the arena floor, causing the stone to ripple like water. Naruto shot upward like a missile, breaking the sound barrier instantly. A sonic boom thundered over the stadium, drowning out the screams of the crowd and momentarily stunning the combatants below. He moved faster than the eye could track, a orange and black blur ascending toward the giant snake's head. He landed on the snout of the colossal serpent with a heavy thud that made the beast recoil in pain. The snake hissed, thrashing its head wildly to dislodge the irritant, but Naruto held firm. He dug his heels in, creating furrows in the beast's scales. Below him, the arena looked like a toy set, the chaos reduced to abstract motion. To his right, massive clouds of smoke were forming, and from them emerged the giant form of Gamabunta, the Toad boss. Jiraiya stood on the Toad's head, looking exhausted but determined. Gamabunta was engaging the snake, trying to hold its thrashing body still, but the snake was stronger, fueled by the cursed chakra of the Sand Village. Gamabunta glanced sideways as he felt a lightweight yet impossibly heavy presence land on the enemy he was wrestling. He saw the small figure of the Jinchuriki boy standing confidently on the serpent's nose. The snake opened its mouth, as it welling up in its throat, preparing to melt the Toad and the boy alike. Naruto looked down at Gamabunta. The Toad boss watched him, expecting panic, expecting a jutsu, expecting anything other than what he saw. The boy looked calm. He looked bored. Naruto looked the giant Toad in the eye and asked if he needed a hand. The sheer absurdity of the question, the casual tone in the middle of a life-or-death battle against a kaiju-sized snake, caused Gamabunta to blink his large, bulbous eyes. Naruto turned his attention back to the snake beneath him. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't form hand signs. He simply pulled his right arm back. The air around his fist began to warp and distort, the atmosphere growing heavy and dense as the sheer quantity of potential energy gathered in his knuckles. He focused on the memory of his past life, the serious series he had only read about in manga, but now felt in his very soul. He raised his fist toward the sky, preparing to strike the snake with a blow that defied the logic of the material world. The clouds above the stadium began to swirl, sucked into a vortex centered on Naruto's fist. The light in the arena dimmed, not from shadow, but from the light being bent by the gravity of the impending impact. Naruto tightened his glove, his expression set in a mask of stoic determination. He was going to save the village, even if he had to punch the atmosphere to do it. The air above the Hidden Leaf village ceased to flow. For a heartbeat, the wind died. The screams of the terrified audience were swallowed by a vacuum of pressure, and the thrashing of the colossal serpent seemed to stutter. It was as if the world itself had paused to witness the kinetic potential gathering in the small fist of the orange-clad ninja standing atop the beast's snout. Naruto Uzumaki stood with his right arm pulled back, his posture simple and unadorned, yet the space around his knuckles shimmered with a distortion that defied the laws of optics. The atmosphere grew heavy, bending light inward like a black hole forming in the palm of a human hand. The giant snake beneath him, a creature of summoned chakra and malice, froze. Its primitive senses, honed by centuries of predatory instinct, screamed that the nuisance on its face was no longer a boy, but a walking extinction event. Gamabunta, the Toad boss, watched from his adjacent position, his large, bulbous eyes widening in a display of shock that broke his usually stoic demeanor. He felt a pressure wave radiating from the boy that had nothing to do with chakra and everything to do with raw, unadulterated mass. The Toad braced himself, digging his massive webbed feet into the rubble of the arena, recognizing that standing in the wake of what was coming would be like trying to weather a tsunami with a paper umbrella. The boy looked up toward the storm clouds swirling violently above the village, dark and ominous from the chaos of the invasion. He did not look at the snake. He did not look at the enemies below. He looked straight up, channeling the dormant, bored godhood of his past life, focusing every ounce of his being into a singular vertical vector. With a movement too fast for the naked eye to track, Naruto drove his fist upward. He did not make contact with the snake. He struck the air itself. The result was a cataclysm of physics. The atmosphere immediately above his fist compressed instantly, then exploded outward in a column of pure force. The shockwave was a vertical pillar of destruction that tore through the giant snake's head before the creature could even register pain. There was no blood, no gore, only instant erasure. The molecular bonds holding the snake together were simply overwhelmed, and the upper third of the colossal summon vaporized into a fine mist that was blasted upward into the stratosphere. The remaining bulk of the snake, deprived of its head and its summoner's concentration, convulsed violently before beginning to dispel in a cloud of white smoke. But even that smoke was caught in the updraft of the punch and sucked into the sky. The beam of force continued upward, piercing the dark storm clouds that had shrouded the village in gloom. It punched a hole straight through the cloud layer, a perfect circle of blue sky expanding violently outward as the clouds were pushed away by the sheer displacement of air. The beam did not stop there. It shot into the upper atmosphere, creating a vacuum tunnel that sucked the very oxygen out of the village for a split second. The sound of the impact arrived moments later, a deafening, earth-shattering boom that rattled the foundations of every building within the land of fire. It was a sound not of thunder, but of reality cracking. High above the village, the storm cleared instantly. The dark, angry gray was replaced by a serene, sunny blue, the contrast so sharp it was blinding. The hole in the cloud layer persisted, a permanent circle of sunlight cutting through the gloom like a spotlight from the heavens. In the center of that beam, far above the ozone layer, a rip in the fabric of the sky remained for a fleeting moment, a testament to a punch that had threatened to punch a hole through the planet itself. The recoil of the attack was directed upward, a conscious redirection of force by a mind that instinctively understood terminal velocity and structural integrity. However, the sheer displacement of mass had to go somewhere. The air rushed back in to fill the vacuum left by the punch, creating a downdraft of hurricane proportions. This secondary shockwave swept through the stadium, flattening the remaining arena walls and blowing the dust and debris of the invasion out toward the village perimeter. The sound barrier shattered again as the air pressure normalized, creating a sonic boom that shattered every window in the stadium and for miles in every direction. Glass rained down like glitter in the sunlight, catching the rays of the artificial clear sky. In the stands, the spectators, previously cowering from the invading shinobi, now stared upward in mute horror. The invasion had halted. The sound and sand ninjas stopped their fighting, their eyes drawn to the impossible sight of a column of blue sky where a storm had been just seconds before. The sheer magnitude of the event rendered the concept of war trivial. How could one fight against a force that could change the weather with a single movement? On the rooftop of the stadium, hidden behind the railing of a VIP box, Orochimaru stood frozen. His pale, snake-like face was twisted into an expression of pure, unadulterated ecstasy. He had abandoned his disguise, his neck elongating slightly as he craned to watch the boy descending slowly from the sky. The Sannin had sought the Sharingan for its visual prowess, sought immortality to master every jutsu, but he realized now that he had been aiming too low. What he witnessed in that boy was not chakra manipulation. It was limit breaking. It was the shattering of the glass ceiling of human potential. He watched as Naruto landed softly on the ruined arena floor, the dust settling around him. Orochimaru's golden eyes narrowed, calculating. The fear he should have felt was absent, replaced by a manic scientific hunger. He did not see a hero, he saw a specimen, a container of such infinite density that it could hold the power of a god. He realized that taking Sasuke Uchiha's body was a waste of time. If he could harness the genetic anomaly of Naruto Uzumaki, combine it with his own research, he wouldn't just be immortal, he would be omnipotent. He hissed in delight, his tongue flickering out to taste the ozone-rich air. With a final, lingering look at the boy, Orochimaru melted into the ground, sinking into the earth to retreat to his laboratory. He needed to prepare. The vessel had changed. The timeline had accelerated. He would have this body, no matter the cost. Down on the arena floor, the giant smoke cloud of the dispelled snake finally dissipated, revealing Gamabunta. The toad boss sat amidst the rubble, looking dazed, his skin slightly singed from the sheer heat of the air pressure. He looked at Naruto, who was dusting off his jacket with a casual indifference that bordered on comical given the destruction around him. Gamabunta grunted, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated in the chests of the nearby Jonin. He realized that he was no longer the strongest summon in the battle. In fact, compared to the boy in front of him, he felt like a pet. The toad boss gave a respectful nod to the boy before puffing away in his own cloud of smoke, returning to the summon realm, perhaps to reconsider his life choices. Naruto looked around the stadium. The fighting had stopped. The invaders were fleeing or surrendering, their morale broken by the display of power. He felt a pit form in his stomach. He had held back. He had aimed up. He had tried so hard to be gentle. And yet the windows of the village were broken, the arena was a crater, and the sky was permanently altered. He looked at his hands, trembling slightly. This was the curse of his strength. There was no opponent here, only collateral damage waiting to happen. He could never spar with his friends. He could never compete in a tournament. He was a nuclear weapon in a world of knives. The loneliness he had always felt as an outcast suddenly deepened into a chasm of existential isolation. He was strong, yes, but he was too strong to belong. In the center of the chaos, the battle between the third Hokage and Orochimaru's reanimated cage was reaching its tragic end. Hiruzen Sarutobi, the old professor, lay pinned against the tree by the reanimated Hashirama, the death god looming behind him. As his soul began to be torn from his body, Hiruzen's eyes drifted upward, drawn by the fading light of the vertical punch. He saw the clear blue sky, the hole in the clouds, and the silhouette of the young man standing amidst the ruins. The Hokage's lips quirked into a faint, sorrowful smile. He didn't need to ask who had done it. He could feel the residue of that energy, a power that was not chakra but something more primordial. He realized that the village's future was not in the hands of clans or jutsu, but in this strange, lonely boy. The will of fire was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical force that burned within Naruto, hotter than the sun. With the last of his strength, as darkness took him, the third Hokage whispered a silent prayer to the boy, hoping that he would find a way to wield that power without losing the gentle heart that defined him. The Anbu arrived then, surrounding Naruto not as protectors but as a containment unit. They didn't know what he was, but they could sense the danger. Kakashi stepped forward, his single visible eye wide with a mixture of pride and terror. He signaled the Anbu to stand down, approaching his student slowly. Naruto looked at his sensei, his expression unreadable. He didn't say a word. There was nothing to say. The trophy for winning the exam lay broken in the dirt, a symbol of his shattered normalcy. Days passed, the village moving through the motions of grief and reconstruction. The funeral of the third Hokage was a somber affair, held under the eerie, permanent patch of clear sky that Naruto had punched. The sun beat down on the black-clad mourners, a stark contrast to the rainy gloom that usually accompanied such events. Naruto stood at the back of the crowd, apart from the others. He wore his black suit, the fabric feeling itchy and constricting. He watched as Iruka wept, as Konohamaru cried out for his grandfather. Naruto wanted to cry too, but the tears wouldn't come. He felt a strange numbness, a dissociation from the emotional gravity of the moment. He felt like an observer, a god looking down at ants mourning a fallen king. He hated this feeling. He hated being different. Sasuke stood across the graveyard, his hands in his pockets. He hadn't approached Naruto since the hospital. The Uchiha prodigy looked up at the sky, then at Naruto's back. The jealousy that had fueled him for years had evaporated, replaced by a crushing, hollow despair. He remembered the Chidori, the lightning in his hand, the feeling of absolute power he had cultivated. Then he remembered the punch that cleared the sky. It was like comparing a candle to a supernova. He realized that no amount of training, no amount of hatred would ever allow him to touch that level. He was chasing a ghost. The path to Itachi's death didn't lie through Konoha's training, it lay through Naruto. And if Naruto was this unreachable, then Sasuke was truly alone. He turned and walked away, the distance between them widening not just in meters, but in dimensions of existence. Once the crowds dispersed, Naruto made his way up the cliffside, climbing the stone faces of the Hokage. It was a ritual he performed often, a place to think. But now it felt different. He stood atop the fourth Hokage's head, looking out over the village. The hole in the sky was gone, the clouds had returned, but the memory lingered. He wore his orange tracksuit, the familiar fabric offering little comfort. He felt the weight of the village on his shoulders, heavier than any boulder, heavier than the gravity of his own punches. He realized that his dream of being Hokage had changed. It wasn't about being acknowledged anymore. It was about being a shield, a cage that would contain this monstrous power to protect the people inside. He couldn't be the friendly neighbor ninja who helped with groceries and played pranks. He had to be the monster that scared the other monsters away. Jiraiya approached him from behind, his heavy footsteps scuffing the rock. The toad sage looked older than he had a month ago. The lines around his eyes had deepened, the result of witnessing the funeral and the burden of the truth he now carried. He stopped next to Naruto, looking out over the village with him. The wind picked up, whipping Jiraiya's white hair around his face. Jiraiya broke the silence, asking if Naruto was ready to go. They had a mission, a training trip that would take them away from the village for years. It wasn't a vacation, it was an evacuation. The village needed time to recover, and the village needed Naruto gone. His very presence was a destabilizing factor, a beacon of power that would draw enemies like Orochimaru and the Akatsuki. It was safer for everyone if the god among them wasn't walking the streets. Naruto nodded, his eyes never leaving the horizon. He asked Jiraiya if he thought he could control it. Jiraiya looked at the boy, really looked at him, seeing the soul of the caped Baldy resting behind those blue eyes. He answered honestly. He didn't know, but he promised to help him try. Jiraiya knew that traditional ninja training was useless now. He couldn't teach Naruto to mold chakra. He couldn't teach him jutsu. He could only teach him focus, philosophy, and perhaps how to be bored. Because if Naruto got excited, if he got angry, the world would suffer. They stood there for a moment longer, the sun beginning to set over the village, casting long shadows across the Hokage monument. Naruto placed a hand over his heart. He could feel it beating, a steady, rhythmic drum. But beneath that heartbeat, he could feel another pulse, a slow, powerful rhythm that didn't belong to him. It was the rhythm of the limitless. It was the rhythm of the serious punch. He smiled, a small, resigned quirk of the lips. It was going to be a boring life, a lonely life. But he would make it work. He would be the hero this world needed, even if he had to be the villain to do it. He would protect them, even from himself. As they turned to leave, Naruto took one last look at the stone faces. He wondered if there would ever be a face carved there for him. How did you carve a mountain for someone who could punch through the mountain itself? He laughed at the thought, a short, sharp sound that echoed off the cliff. Jiraiya looked at him, confused, but just shook his head and motioned for him to follow. They walked down the path away from the village toward the gates. The villagers stopped and watched as they passed. There was no cheering, no waving. They watched with a mixture of reverence and fear. They knew. They had all seen the sky break. They knew what he was. Naruto didn't wave back. He kept his head down, his hands in his pockets, suppressing the urge to touch anything, to break anything, to accidentally crush the pavement beneath his feet. He focused entirely on the simple act of walking. One foot in front of the other, control, restraint, life. Meanwhile, in a dimension far removed from the elemental nations, in a place of infinite darkness and swirling voids, a portal slid open with a hiss of decompressed air. A tall figure stepped through, wearing a long, flowing cape that billowed in the non-existent wind. He wore a suit of high-tech armor, his face obscured by a visor. He held a device in his hand that was beeping rapidly, a sensor designed to detect fluctuations in the fabric of reality. The beeping intensified into a solid tone, indicating a source of unimaginable power nearby. The figure looked out across the dimensional gap, his visor locking onto a distant blue planet. The device pointed straight at it. He adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable behind the visor. The readings were off the charts. It wasn't chakra. It wasn't magic. It was raw physical power on a cosmic scale. It was an anomaly that shouldn't exist in this universe. Blast, the #1 S-class hero of his own world, narrowed his eyes. He had felt the ripple from here, a shockwave that had traveled through dimensions. He knew what that kind of power meant. It meant the limiters were being broken again. He muttered into his communicator that he had found him. He had found the anomaly. With a wave of his hand, he opened a portal directly to the source of the signal, stepping forward to investigate this new god who had shattered the sky. The portal snapped shut behind him, leaving the void empty and silent, as the ninja world remained completely unaware that its strongest protector had just caught the attention of a hero from another universe.